Did you know that there is a place in New Mexico where you can stand on sand dunes that are made entirely of white gypsum crystals? Not the tan or golden sand you find on every other beach and desert in the world, but pure white sand that stretches for miles in every direction. A landscape so otherworldly and so unlike anything else on Earth that the United States military used it as a stand-in for the surface of the moon during astronaut training. Did you know that New Mexico is home to one of the most significant scientific installations in the history of human civilization? A place where the most destructive weapon ever created was detonated for the first time. A moment that divided human history into before and after in a way that almost nothing else ever has. And that you can drive to the exact spot where it happened and stand on the ground where the world changed forever. Did you know that New Mexico contains within its borders one of the most complete cross-sections of ecological diversity of any state in America? From the Chihuahuan Desert in the south, which is the largest desert in North America, to the alpine tundra of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the north, where peaks rise above 13,000 feet and support ecosystems more similar to the Rocky Mountain high country of Colorado than to anything most people associate with the American Southwest. Did you know that New Mexico is the only state in America where a fully functioning, living, Indo-European language that is not English has been spoken continuously for over 4 centuries? A language brought by Spanish colonizers in the 1500s that has survived in the mountain villages of northern New Mexico in a form so archaic that linguists consider it closer to the Spanish of Cervantes than to any modern Spanish dialect spoken anywhere in the world today. And did you know that despite all of this, despite the white sand dunes and the atomic bomb, and the ecological diversity in the living medieval Spanish, New Mexico consistently ranks among the poorest states in America, a place of extraordinary assets and extraordinary contradictions that the rest of the country has never fully known what to do with. Because New Mexico is not a state that fits into any of the categories most Americans use to understand the places on their map. It is not the Southwest in the way that Arizona is the Southwest. It is not the South. It is not the Midwest. It is not the West in the way that California or Colorado is the West. It is something genuinely its own, a place of layered complexity, ancient cultures, dramatic landscapes, world-changing science, and persistent poverty that adds up to one of the most genuinely anomalous states in the entire country. And in this video, we are going to explore every dimension of that anomaly. From the geology that produced its extraordinary landscape diversity, to the cultures that have been layering on top of each other for thousands of years. From the scientific installations that changed the world to the economic contradictions that have kept one of America's most asset-rich states among its most economically challenged. This is the full story of the massive anomaly hiding in New Mexico. Let's get into it. The first thing you need to understand about New Mexico is that it is much larger and much more geographically diverse than most Americans realize. It is the 5th largest state in the country by area, larger than California, larger than Montana, larger than every state east of the Mississippi, and it contains within that area a range of landscapes, elevations, and ecological zones that would be extraordinary in a region twice its size. The popular image of New Mexico is desert, red rock, sagebrush, roadrunners, the kind of dry, sun-baked landscape that shows up in 1,000 Western movies and that is genuinely present in significant portions of the state. But that image captures perhaps 1/3 of what New Mexico actually is and completely misses the rest. To understand the full geographic picture of New Mexico, you have to think about it as a state organized around a series of dramatic vertical transitions, from desert floor to mountain summit, that compress an extraordinary range of ecosystems into relatively short horizontal distances. The Rio Grande is the geographic spine of New Mexico, running north to south through the center of the state in a valley that has been the focus of human settlement for thousands of years. The Rio Grande Rift, the geological feature that created the river's valley, is one of the most significant tectonic features in North America, a zone where the Earth's crust is literally being pulled apart, thinning and subsiding along a line that runs from southern Colorado through the length of New Mexico and into Texas in Mexico. The rift has produced a landscape of dramatic contrasts: the flat, fertile floodplain of the river itself, flanked by volcanic plateaus and mountain ranges that rise steeply on both sides, The volcanoes of the Jemez Mountains to the west of Santa Fe, the Sandia Mountains rising abruptly above Albuquerque to the east of the Rio Grande, the vast lava fields of the Carrizozo Malpayas in central New Mexico. All are products of the volcanic and tectonic activity associated with the Rio Grande Rift, and all contribute to a landscape that is geologically young, geologically active, and geologically extraordinary. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the southernmost sub-range of the Rocky Mountains, run along the northeastern edge of New Mexico in a chain of peaks that reaches elevations comparable to the highest mountains in Colorado. Wheeler Peak, the highest point in New Mexico, tops out at 13,161 feet, high enough to support alpine tundra ecosystems, permanent snowfields, and a suite of cold-adapted plant and animal communities that would be completely at home in the high Rockies of Colorado or Wyoming. The transition from the desert floor of the Rio Grande Valley to the alpine summit of Wheeler Peak represents a change in elevation of nearly 10,000 feet, a vertical journey that passes through half a dozen distinct ecological zones that take you, in the space of a long day's drive, from a landscape that feels like northern Mexico to a landscape that feels like Alaska. To the south and east, the landscape transitions into the Chihuahuan Desert, the largest desert in North America, extending from southern New Mexico through West Texas and deep into the Mexican states of Chihuahua and Coahuila. The Chihuahuan Desert is a high-elevation desert. Much of it sits above 3,500 feet, which gives it a character different from the low desert of Arizona and California. Cooler winters, more seasonable precipitation, and a plant community dominated by creosote bush, yucca, and sotol create a landscape that is as austere and beautiful in a way that rewards patient attention. The Chihuahuan Desert is home to an extraordinary diversity of reptiles, birds, and plants, including over 800 species of cacti, more than any other desert in the world. That makes it one of the most biodiverse desert systems on the planet, despite its reputation for emptiness. And then there is White Sands. The White Sands National Park in the Tularosa Basin of southern New Mexico protects the largest gypsum dune field in the world. 275 square miles of brilliant white sand dunes made not of silica, like most desert sand, but of gypsum crystals carried by wind from the dried bed of an ancient lake. The result is a landscape of surreal, almost supernatural beauty. Dunes of pure white rising and falling across a basin ringed by mountains. The sand so reflective that it creates its own microclimate of slightly cooler temperatures. The surface so unlike any other landscape on Earth that it genuinely stops people in their tracks when they first encounter it. White Sands is one of the most visually extraordinary places in the United States. It is also, by the standards of the national parks, relatively uncrowded, a reflection of New Mexico's general underappreciation as a destination rather than of any deficiency is what the park offers. The geographic anomaly of New Mexico is matched and in some ways surpassed by its cultural anomaly. The layering of indigenous, Spanish colonial, and American cultures on top of each other over thousands of years in ways that have produced something found nowhere else in the United States and arguably nowhere else in the world. The indigenous presence in New Mexico is not just ancient history. It is a living, present, culturally vital reality that predates every other chapter of the state's story by thousands of years, and that continues to shape New Mexico in ways that are visible everywhere you look, if you are paying attention. The Pueblo peoples, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the Taos, the Santo Domingo, and the 19 other Pueblo nations of New Mexico have been living in the Rio Grande Valley and the surrounding region for at least 1,000 years in settled communities of remarkable cultural sophistication. The Acoma Pueblo, sitting on top of a 367-foot sandstone mesa in western New Mexico, has been continuously inhabited for over 1,000 years, making it one of the oldest continuously occupied communities in North America. The Taos Pueblo, in the mountains of northern Mexico, has been continuously inhabited for at least 800 years and remains a living community today. Its multi-story adobe buildings rising against the backdrop of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, in a composition that has been photographed more times than almost any other architectural subject in the American West. The Spanish colonial presence in New Mexico is equally deep and equally anomalous by the standards of American cultural geography. Spain established a permanent colonial settlement at Santa Fe in 1610, 10 years before the Mayflower landed at Plymouth, 169 years before the United States came into existence as a nation. The Spanish colonial capital of Santa Fe is the oldest capital city in the United States, older than any other city in the country outside of indigenous settlements that preceded European arrival. The culture that developed in colonial New Mexico over the following 3 centuries, the architecture, the art, the food, the religious traditions, the Spanish language that survived in such an archaic form in the mountain villages, is not Mexican culture, and not modern Spanish culture, and not American culture. It is something that evolved in relative isolation in the high desert and mountain valleys of northern New Mexico over centuries, and it has produced a regional identity of extraordinary distinctiveness. The New Mexican Spanish, spoken in the villages of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, places like Chamayo, Truchas, and Trampas, is the subject of genuine academic fascination. Linguists who have studied it describe it as preserving features of 16th century Castilian Spanish that have been lost in every other Spanish-speaking community in the world. Words, grammatical structures, and pronunciations that disappeared from the Spanish of Spain and Latin America centuries ago have survived in the mountain villages of northern New Mexico because the isolation of those communities, cut off by mountains from the major currents of Spanish language evolution in Mexico and Spain, allowed an older form of the language to persist. It is the linguistic equivalent of a living fossil, a form of human speech that carries within it the DNA of a world that no longer exists anywhere else. The interaction between the Pueblo cultures and the Spanish colonial culture produced a syncretic religious and artistic tradition that is one of the most fascinating cultural phenomena in North America. The Santos, the carved wooden religious figures made by New Mexican artists in the Spanish colonial tradition, blend European Catholic iconography with indigenous artistic sensibilities in ways that produced an art form found nowhere else. The architecture of the Spanish colonial missions, most dramatically at the Taos Pueblo, and at the San Francisco de Asís Church in Rancho de Taos, the subject of one of the most famous photographs in American art history, combines European religious building forms with indigenous adobe construction techniques in a way that is completely specific to New Mexico. The Pueblo Revival architectural style that defines Santa Fe, and that has been applied to buildings from government offices to hotels, to private homes, is a conscious reference to this synthesis, an attempt to root the built environment of New Mexico in its specific cultural and geographic context in a way that most American cities, with their generic commercial architecture, have completely abandoned. The American arrival in New Mexico, formalized by the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, added a third cultural layer on top of the indigenous and Spanish colonial ones, without fully displacing either. New Mexico became a territory in 1850, but did not become a state until 1912, the last of the contiguous states to be admitted to the Union, and the delay was in significant part a reflection of the Anglo-American political establishment's discomfort with a population that was majority Hispanic and indigenous, rather than the white Protestant majority that dominated the rest of the country. The cultural complexity that made New Mexico seem foreign and ungovernable to the 19th century American political mainstream is the same complexity that makes it one of the most culturally fascinating places in the country today. New Mexico's geographic isolation and vast empty spaces made it, in the 20th century, the site of some of the most consequential scientific work in human history. The state's anomalous position, remote, sparsely populated, blessed with clear skies and enormous stretches of federal land, made it the preferred location for projects that required secrecy, space, and distance from populated areas. And the projects that were conducted in New Mexico's deserts and mountains changed the world in ways that are still reverberating. The Manhattan Project's Los Alamos Laboratory, established in 1943 on a remote mesa in the Jemez Mountains of northern New Mexico, was the site where the atomic bomb was designed and built. The choice of Los Alamos was deliberate, a remote, isolated location accessible by a single road, surrounded by federal land, far from any major population center, with a climate and an elevation that suited the needs of a secret scientific installation. The scientists who came to Los Alamos, among them some of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, including J. Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, Niels Bohr, and dozens of others, worked in conditions of extraordinary secrecy to produce a weapon that ended World War II and inaugurated the nuclear age. Trinity Site, in the Jornada del Muerto desert of central New Mexico, is where the first atomic bomb was detonated on July 16, 1945. The detonation, codenamed Trinity, produced a fireball visible from hundreds of miles away, a shockwave that shattered windows in towns across southern New Mexico, and a crater of fused desert sand that was radioactive for years afterward. The site is now within the White Sands Missile Range and is open to the public twice a year, standing at ground zero, at the exact spot where the nuclear age began, in the middle of the New Mexico desert, surrounded by the same landscape that absorbed the first nuclear blast, is one of the most sobering and most historically significant experiences available anywhere in the United States, and most Americans have never thought to make the trip. Los Alamos National Laboratory continues to operate today as one of the most important scientific research institutions in the country, a laboratory working on nuclear weapons, maintenance, national security science, energy research, and fundamental scientific questions across a range of disciplines. The presence of Los Alamos, combined with Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque, gives New Mexico a concentration of federally funded scientific research that is extraordinary relative to the state's population. The federal government spends more money per capita on research and development in New Mexico than in almost any other state, a reflection of the state's continued importance to the national security infrastructure and to the scientific programs that flow from it. The Very Large Array, the radio telescope installation sitting on the plains of San Agustin in western New Mexico, is one of the most recognizable scientific installations in the world. Its 27 massive dish antennas arranged in a Y-shaped configuration across the high desert floor, in an image that has appeared in films, magazines, and textbooks from around the world. The VLA has been used to conduct some of the most significant radio astronomy research of the last half-century, mapping the structure of galaxies, studying black holes, detecting the radio emissions of objects at the edge of the observable universe. It sits in the New Mexico desert because the high altitude, the dry climate, and the radio frequency quietude of the remote location make it one of the best places on Earth for radio telescope observations. Like so much of what New Mexico has to offer, it is extraordinary, and it is hidden in plain sight in a state that most people drive through without stopping. Here's the contradiction that sits at the heart of everything we've talked about in this video. New Mexico has ancient mountains and extraordinary deserts and world-changing scientific installations, and one of the most culturally layered and distinctive identities of any state in the country. And it is also, by most measures, one of the poorest states in America. New Mexico consistently ranks near the bottom of state rankings for median household income, for child poverty, for educational attainment, for healthcare access, and for a range of other economic and social indicators that tell the story of a state that has not found a way to translate its extraordinary assets into broadly shared economic prosperity. The poverty rate in New Mexico is among the highest in the country. The child poverty rate, the percentage of children living below the poverty line, is one of the highest in America, a statistic that carries real human consequences in a state with a young and growing population. The reasons for this economic paradox are multiple and interconnected, and they are rooted in the specific history and geography of New Mexico in ways that are genuinely difficult to untangle. The federal government owns roughly 35% of the land in New Mexico. National forests, national parks, military reservations, Bureau of Land Management lands, which limits the tax base available to state and local governments, while simultaneously providing the employment and economic activity associated with federal installations, like Los Alamos and the White Sands Missile Range. The reservation lands of the Navajo Nation, the Pueblo Nations, and the Apache Nations cover additional significant portions of the state's territory and are governed under a separate legal framework that creates its own set of economic challenges and opportunities. The oil and gas industry provides significant tax revenues to the state. New Mexico has been one of the major beneficiaries of the Permian Basin oil boom that has transformed the energy geography of the American Southwest. But the distribution of that wealth within the state has not translated into the kind of broad-based economic development that would move the needle on the poverty and educational attainment numbers. The energy revenues have helped fund state government and have provided a fiscal cushion that has been important in recent years. But they have not solved the underlying structural challenges of an economy that has not developed the diverse industrial base needed to provide broadly accessible economic opportunity. The tourism economy, despite the state's extraordinary assets, has never reached its potential. New Mexico receives far fewer visitors than neighboring states with comparable or lesser natural and cultural attractions. Fewer than Arizona, fewer than Colorado, fewer than Utah. The reason for this underperformance are not entirely clear, but they likely include the state's relative lack of major airports and interstate highway connections, the perception of New Mexico as remote and difficult to reach, and the simple fact that the national conversation about Western tourism has never given New Mexico the attention that its assets deserve. The question of what New Mexico will be in the coming decades is one of the most genuinely open geographic questions in the American West. The state has assets, the landscapes, the cultures, the scientific institutions, the energy resources that should, in theory, support a much stronger economic position than it currently occupies. The gap between what New Mexico has and what it has been able to do with what it has is the central challenge and the central opportunity of the state's future. Santa Fe has been growing as a destination for remote workers, artists, retirees, and people leaving more expensive Western cities who have discovered that the combination of beauty, culture, climate, and relative affordability that Santa Fe offers is genuinely rare. The city's art market, one of the largest in the United States, centered on the Canyon Road Gallery district, and the annual Indian market and Spanish market that draw collectors from around the world, has given it an economic identity that goes beyond tourism into genuine cultural commerce. The restaurants, the architecture, the opera. The Santa Fe Opera is one of the most prestigious summer opera festivals in the world, presenting productions against a backdrop of desert mountains that is unlike any other opera house setting on Earth. All contribute to a quality of life offering that is beginning to attract the kind of investment and migration that could shift the economic trajectory of at least the northern part of the state. Albuquerque, the state's largest city, has been working through a more complicated growth story, one that combines genuine economic development in the technology and film production sectors with persistent challenges around crime, poverty, and infrastructure that have slowed its emergence as a major Sunbelt destination. The film industry has been a significant and somewhat surprising growth sector for Albuquerque. The success of television productions filmed in New Mexico, famously Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, has put the city on the cultural map in ways that have had real economic consequences, attracting additional film and television production and generating a level of national attention that has translated into tourism and broader awareness of what the state has to offer. The energy transition presents both a risk and an opportunity for New Mexico. The Permian Basin oil revenues that have been filling the state's coffers are tied to an industry whose long-term trajectory is uncertain as the global economy moves toward cleaner energy sources. But New Mexico's solar and wind resources are among the best in the country. The high desert of the state receives some of the highest levels of solar radiation in the United States, and the wind resources of the Eastern Plains are substantial. The potential for New Mexico to become a major clean energy producer and exporter is real. and the transition from fossil fuel revenues to clean energy revenues, if it can be managed well, could provide the state with a durable fiscal foundation that does not depend on the boom and bust cycles of the oil market. So what is the massive anomaly hiding in New Mexico? Is it a state that contains multitudes, ancient landscapes and cutting-edge science, medieval Spanish and living indigenous cultures, white sand dunes and alpine tundra, nuclear history, and one of the most beautiful opera houses in the world? It is a state that has been shaped by forces, geological, cultural, historical, economic, that are more complex and more layered than any simple narrative can capture. And it is a state that the rest of America has chronically underestimated, undervisited, and underappreciated in ways that say more about the limitations of the national imagination than about any deficiency in New Mexico itself. The anomaly of New Mexico is not just that it contains so many surprising things. It is that it contains them all simultaneously, in a space where they have been interacting and overlapping, and producing something genuinely new for centuries. The Pueblo potter and the nuclear physicist, the Spanish village and the world-class opera house, the Chihuahuan desert and the alpine tundra, the oldest capital city in America, and one of the most important scientific laboratories in the world. All of it in the same state. All of it available to anyone willing to look past the reputation and engage with the reality. New Mexico has been hiding in plain sight, and what it is hiding is one of the most extraordinary collections of landscapes, cultures, and histories assembled within any single state's borders in the entire United States. While we do our best to provide you with the most accurate information, these are, after all, just our take based on data and research we analyzed. New Mexico is vast, complex, and full of surprises. You should visit, explore, and form your own picture. Subscribe if you haven't already. We put out videos every week where we dig into the geography and the story behind the places people live. If you're the kind of person who's always wondering why places look and feel the way they do, this is the channel for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.